All right.
But I'm still going to be hungry.
Just finish your breakfast, probably. How's your family?
Okay, why don't we go ahead and get started. Want to welcome everyone to our Thursday conference. Hopefully everyone's well rested after their Thanksgiving holiday. And I'm also delighted to introduce this week's speaker, who's someone I've known for a number of years as a colleague and a friend and a Facebook friend and other things. And Laura's had a lot of interaction with our program over the years. Some of you have, in a previous job, have done internships with her, and I think leading to some hires, which is always a good thing. So Laura Kreofsky is our speaker. She's currently principal strategist at the Medsys Group, and she'll tell us what she's doing. She's worked in health IT for 25 years. Working with healthcare organizations nationally and internationally, doing various technology-enabled clinical and business activities. She has a great deal of expertise in health information technology and related areas like population health, health information exchange, patient engagement, and so forth. She has 2 master's degrees, an MHA and an MBA from the University of Minnesota. And she lives in Portland and in her spare time does hot yoga and trail running in Forest Park. So, and so she's going to be interactive. So remember, for those of you who want to say something, to press the button on the microphone in front of you. Not so much for here, but for people who are listening online. And in fact, for those people listening online, if you want to send a question, that's the usual thing. Just send a tweet with the hashtag DMICEConf, DMICECNOF, and we'll pass it to Laura.
Thanks, Bill. Can you guys hear me okay? He's giving me, not the finger, but he's giving me a motion. Up, higher? Oh.
You need to turn it on.
You told me to turn it on.
Oh, it is on. It's on. It's on. Oh.
Hello.
Okay.
Test.
Maybe just want you to start talking.
All right, I'll start saying things. All right. So, Bill, Virginia, everyone, thank you for having me here today. And I am going to give kind of an overview of healthcare technology, and I call it in the trenches. It's really what it looks like from the community hospital or the IDN healthcare system. Just sort of contrast that to what you might be have experienced in your prior lives or learning from an academic perspective. And I want to keep it light. I want to keep it conversational. So I'll throw out questions, or please ask me questions as we go. As Bill said, I've been in healthcare in healthcare IT for about 25 years. And I got into this, as I get into most things in my life, I stumbled into it. I was doing my summer internship at the Hennepin County Medical Center in Minneapolis. And I was in the University of Minnesota MHA program, which was basically at the time a grooming program for hospital CIOs, or CEOs, excuse me. And they said, you're going to go to Hennepin County Medical Center for the summer, and you're going to work in the IT shop. And my first response, honest to God, was, they use computers in healthcare? And yeah, so that's where I started. And it's been a fun ride ever since, and I've done a whole host of things. As Bill said, I have a number of areas that I've focused on in my career, but I've worked for Kaiser Permanente. I worked for the state of Wisconsin. I've spent most of my time in consulting. I did take a year off and do a sort of a foray into a software startup company, which just affirmed how much I loved consulting. So lots of experience to draw from. And presently, I work for a small consulting firm called the Medsys Group. And Medsys Group has been around for a long time, but they were primarily, for many years, a staffing and staff aug company. Really did a lot of that in the late 2000, really the sort of early era of the high-tech era, so 2008 to 2011, kind of their heyday. And they've shifted into do more consulting. But one of the trends in our industry as a whole, and you'll see this in some of my slides, is this sort of that frenzy of healthcare technology is waning. And so healthcare systems, healthcare organizations, consulting firms, et cetera, are their buying patterns, their hiring patterns are adapting to those changes. Let's see if this is my true test of technology here. So a couple things really I'm going to focus on today are some, just to sort of set the stage, a couple of industry trends, and then talk about healthcare IT, kind of what I see in the market as a whole, and then focus in on a couple of areas, particularly around patient engagement, HIE, and analytics. And this picture on the right is the Robert Wood Johnson presentation. It's actually a very good report. It just came out earlier this year. I draw from it in my presentation. I draw from a number of other sources, but if you're looking for something about this thick to read over Christmas break, it'd be the one. To kind of put in context what I do, because like what do you do when you're a thought leader or you do healthcare IT strategy? Right now, I'm working on 3 projects spanning 9 time zones, which is a little bit of a problem for my sleep patterns. I'm working at a large academic medical system in California. They went out and acquired a community healthcare system kind of without enough due diligence, which is kind of akin to one of us buying a cabin off the internet. It looked great in the pictures. And now they've hired myself and a host of other people to help them really untangle the technology, everything from the cabling and the infrastructure, which is obsolete, to 800 unboxed WinXP computers they found in a storeroom, to moving from one electronic health record to the system electronic health record. I'm also actually, I think I mentioned I did some work for the state of Wisconsin early in my career. Been hired by the state of Wisconsin to help them plan an electronic health record for the 7 treatment facilities the state of Wisconsin runs for the mentally ill, the developmentally disabled, and for some prisoners that need either mental health or clinical care. So again, applying those skills in a really diverse setting. And then my nights, literally, and weekends job is I'm working with a healthcare system in South Africa. They're deploying a Zoom Plus-like healthcare system in South Africa, and they hope to spread it across other countries in Southern Africa. And they've reached out to us, so helping to do EHR strategy in a very different context with very different, sort of financial constraints, different patient populations, et cetera. So it's a lot of fun, the work that I do. All right, enough of that. So really just 3 sort of themes that I'm sure you're all aware of in the big picture. The first major force in healthcare today is this shifting financial accountability, moving from the volume to the value to population health. What this is driving is really more importance of data analytics, financial modeling, data transparency, and new tools for accessing that information from both a provider side and from a patient side. And one of the things you're going to see in my slides in general, and I'd love to use this pointer, but I'm sure I'll break it if I do, the correlation between the demographics of our population and the use of new technology tools. And all of this basically says that, and to no surprise, the millennials are the ones that are using online tools to really understand the financial costs of their health care and to do cost shopping or to cost comparison. The second sort of major theme is regulatory activity. About a year ago, I started subscribing to a newsletter called Politico, and they have every morning the morning e-health news or something. It's really fascinating, but it's also really depressing to read this newsletter every day, because it really focuses on all of the regulatory and the legislative activity around healthcare IT. And for a long time, I tried to really stay abreast of it, and then I realized it was kind of like a soup of the day. There was always a new congressman proposing a new law or new regulation. My favorite was probably this first one, which is they were going to create legislation to fix the EHR issues. That was all the further they had defined it, but nevertheless, they did get their name in the trade regs. The representatives' bills and activity, you've probably heard of some of these, obviously meaningful use you've heard, but there are just this ongoing flurry of activity at the legislative and the regulatory level. On one hand, it's great to have the attention. On the other hand, I'm concerned it will slow innovation in the industry. The third sort of high-level trend or driver of where we are as a economy, a healthcare economy, and I mean that both from a delivery standpoint and from a financial standpoint, is one that's really driven by the individuals, and that's consumerism. We're moving to a place where we want affordable, convenient healthcare, and we're shaping that. And I was thinking about it. What if we all went into the bank? First we scheduled appointments, then we went into the bank, and then we waited for a while, and then somebody came to us, and then we sat down with them, and then they gave us our $100. I mean, that's kind of how we've delivered healthcare, and in large part we continue to do so. I found this statistic fascinating about how much time and how much that time costs us just arranging for, seeking health care in the United States. Yes?
Healthcare defined.
Health,
How is the process of seeking healthcare? How is that defined?
just in terms of not just the seeking process, either literally arranging for health care or getting health care delivered to you. So maybe seeking and delivering would be a better way of phrasing that. Nevertheless, it's a pretty expensive equation. One of the things that fascinates me about consumerism is how the industry is responding and who in the healthcare industry, healthcare delivery sector is responding. And it's not necessarily the big healthcare systems. It's a lot of what we're seeing in terms of response to a drive for convenience and accessibility is coming from non-traditional payers. In particular, the big the big drugstore, the Walgreens and the CVS. I'm not sure if I can do this. I know you told me which button it is, but like I said, I'll probably blow it up. About 2 months ago, the New York Times had a fascinating article around CVS and what CVS is doing to move away from being a drugstore to being a healthcare service provider. Really, again, worth reading if you really geek out as much as I do about these types of things. But what we're seeing is a big shift, and we see this in Zoom Plus here in the Pacific Northwest, is moving away from the traditional healthcare model based on our preferences towards something that's quicker, faster, cheaper, and potentially better. And important for us is as the CVSs and the Walgreens, et cetera, make this transition or drive this transition, they're doing it in a way that is technology enabled. So they're partnering with healthcare systems, which I'll get to in a second, and or they're enabling their own drugstores, their own clinics with technology, whether it be Epic, Greenway Health has been another big one, or their own homegrown system. As I was working on this slide a couple months ago, or maybe a month ago, CVS bought Target, all of Target's clinics, so it went from 6 to 5 as overnight. There are about 1,700 urgent care minute clinic type entities in the United States, and that number will continue to grow. For anybody who's been around for a long time, these things took off about 10 years ago, and then they sort of dissipated or went quiet for about 4 years. And now the prevalence of these has really increased, and I think will continue to increase. And I think that a lot of that is driven by the Affordable Care Act, because we had to get the incentives aligned to get the care delivery models to move in the right direction. What I think is important about on this slide is that the health system affiliations. This is what's different about retail clinics today than sort of the first generation. The CVS's, the Walmarts, the Target, whatever, they're going out and they're seeking affiliations with big healthcare systems. The Banner healthcare systems, the Providences. What that does is, from a technology standpoint, allows the potential to share systems, to share data, and also it becomes sort of a referral chain where you go from the minute clinic to a primary care provider to the acute care setting, up that food chain. Much more deliberate, much more strategic than it was sort of in the first round. So any questions or comments thus far? No? Anybody need more pizza? Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about where the industry is in terms of the adoption of healthcare technology, particularly EHRs. That's kind of the catch-all bucket, although there's a ton of other solutions and systems out there. And then talk a little bit about patient engagement and analytics and HIE, sort of the ugly stepdaughter or stepchild of all of healthcare IT. I mentioned this earlier. You know, we've sort of hit that peak of just rampant shopping for healthcare systems and EHRs, although there will always be an ongoing sort of cycle of replacement of technologies. I think, in my opinion, really the 2009, 2012 era was the heyday. And this is when a lot of companies, you know, if you could spell IT, you too could be an Epic implementer. That's shifting. Those skills are still going to be needed, but more refined skills and a different set of skills. And actually, Steve, right? We were talking about this a little bit earlier, is that from a physician standpoint, healthcare systems have had sort of the doc champions for the EHR, the physician champions, oftentimes stepping away from their clinical practice to help out. And then they had the CMIO role, sort of that political figurehead. I do believe there is an emergence of a strata in between that of, importantly, clinical informaticists working on population health, working on, you know, specific disease cohorts. I'm starting to see that in big healthcare systems. A couple interesting graphs. Here one is just the uptick of hospital EHRs. And you think, great, we're at 75%. Well, that's at least a basic EHR. When you look more closely at the graph, it reflects that 34% of health or hospital systems have what they call a comprehensive EHR. And this would be sort of the more fuller functionality, both from a transactional standpoint, but also from a health information exchange or data exchange standpoint. Physician side, again, the numbers look really good. But what I found interesting about this is the metrics are different. So the hospital one is looking at a comprehensive EHR, a basic EHR, and then the 75% is at least a basic EHR. On the physician one, we've got this sort of ambiguous any EHR at 82%. So, you know, I don't know what that means, and I think it's sort of poor analytics, if nothing else, and poor statistics and data representation. But in truth, if you take a look at just the basic EHR, we're at 41% and 50% adoption. So it's you know, we have a long ways to go. And proof of that is probably my favorite slide in the whole world. This is taken from a visit I had to a healthcare provider who will remain anonymous. In 2013, I was in getting a foot x-rayed or something. And so it's kind of bad that it's 2013. It's also kind of bad that at the time, this healthcare organization had spent probably $75 million on their EHR. I know because I did the total cost of ownership model for this hospital a few years prior, 2006, 2007. So they'd actually been live on the EHR for about 6 years. I walk in, I sit down, they give me this clipboard to fill out. They ask for my name, and I write same as above because it's actually in the upper right-hand corner. They ask for my date of birth, and I write same as above. And then they ask me my allergies and my meds, and when I last had a tetanus shot, and which of course I have no idea. So I just write in the EHR, in the EHR, and in the EHR. And I give this all to the radiology tech who's clearly not humored. I don't think it's better. Because my first time I ever used this slide in a presentation, I popped it up on the screen. Am I allowed to swear in here? Okay. I popped it up on the screen, and I looked up there, and I thought, shit, that's my Social Security number. It turned out it wasn't my Social Security number, it's my MRN, but I thought, oh my God, they actually have my Social Security number on this printout label. All right, so I used that slide to say, even the most advanced healthcare organization has a long ways to go in the actual adoption and the optimization of their EHR. But there's hope, because just last night, 2.5 years later, I got a letter from this same healthcare system, because I have to go back and I have to get my foot checked again. They've advanced, because they're not giving me the clipboard. This time they actually mailed the forms to me to fill out. I was like, you have got to be kidding me. Anyways, but this is just really sort of endemic in the industry, right? We just, as advanced as we are so entrenched in our practices. But hope springs eternal, because we have all these brand new technologies. How many of you are familiar with this Gartner hype curve? Yeah, I'm sure you are. Sir.
My question is about that for you, Brian, and just how, given what you know is possible right now, how would that be different in your ideal scenario?
Yeah, great question. Well, first of all, the form is unnecessary, right? They've just checked me in. I could have done this on a kiosk. Well, I went to this clinic once, and the kiosk was broken. But besides that, they know my allergies. They know my medications. I should walk in, they say, hey, Laura, are you still allergic to X and Y and Z? And I say, yeah. When they see the care provider. And they're going to ask me these questions anyways. When I sit down, they're going to say, are these your medications? And I'm going to say, yeah, they're the same ones I just wrote on the form that you have in the EHR, only they're spelled correctly in the EHR. So I think just this notion that we're creating extra process or extra work, because that's the way we've always done it.
This esteemed healthcare delivery institution, I've filled out a number, despite the fact that our records have been in Epic for, going on 8 years, we do the same thing. In fact, my daughter, who's having a dermatology consult, got a letter asking her to fill out all this on paper.
Yeah.
So it is endemic.
I just threw the papers out when I got them last night. After I blew a gasket, and then I threw the papers out. So the Gartner hype curve has been around forever, and it really sort of shows longitudinally sort of the waxing and waning of healthcare technologies. And it's a little hard to read, but so if you read from left to right, you have this sort of new innovative technologies. And then you go to this peak of inflated expectations where it's going to do everything. And then you hit the trough of disillusionment. You get to the slope of enlightenment and plateau of productivity. Somewhere over here is speech recognition and probably the EHR. But people love this graph because, this is how we have operated as an industry, is it's the next shiny object, right? So you'll see prescriptive analytics is kind of on the way up. Big data, cloud computing, yada, yada, yada. My favorite, however, let's see if I can, it's hard to read, but this says software-defined anything. And I was like, did somebody just slip that in, or is it actually a technology? But we get to this notion that we're always chasing sort of the next great thing, where we're not really optimizing or effectively deploying the technologies we do have. So when you step back and ask the CIOs of the sort of the community healthcare systems and the IDNs, what are their top priorities? They look very different from that hype curve. And this came from the advisory board earlier this year. Advisory board's a good research firm. Many things related to analytics and BI, cost and performance management and analytics around that. Enterprise integration architecture. I think that's stemming from a lot of mergers and acquisitions, a lot of healthcare systems and data that need to be aligned and better governed. But not a lot of those really sexy things that you saw over here on the hype curve, which reflects to me that sort of the difference between where we are going and where we are at practically. Interestingly enough, health information exchange, data integration per se, isn't on here. I think they're either so frustrated with it, or they're just CIOs are trying to ignore it because it's such a painful topic of conversation typically. I'm going to shift now and dive into a couple of these, just kind of yeah, go ahead.
I'm just wondering, is this top 10 in the order of importance?
No, unfortunately.
Okay.
I couldn't bullet them.
Security at the bottom is like,
Yeah, no, that's a great question. A lot of what I read and hear and see is that security is probably one of the top 3 concerns within healthcare systems, and it's data security and it's network security, patient privacy. And we'll see that a little bit as we talk about health information exchange and that component. The privacy, data security is really a challenge. It was really fun actually looking for pictures of David Letterman too. Anybody see him? He's got right now this great big white beard. Did you guys see that? You see, David, what happened?
What were some of the examples under mobility or Internet of Things for healthcare?
I think it's more just mobile applications, both from a provider standpoint and from a...
Not like linked to medical devices at home or something like that?
That's part of it. And it's that kind of blurs between patient engagement and patient data contributions. And I do think the whole connected biomedical devices and the data flow from there is going to be hugely important going forward. So I've been a fan and fascinated by patient engagement for a long time, and I really think we're at a point where it's starting to mature or evolve, and we're talking now really more in partnership, oftentimes with our healthcare providers and our provider organizations. A lot of that is around cost effectiveness, value, and ROI. It's a different type of conversation than we had 10, 15 years ago. Who's driving this change? Obviously, the millennials are. They just have a different way of conversing, different set of expectations. But interestingly enough, those who are chronically ill, who are really poor health status, they are probably one of the biggest cohorts of actively engaged patients from a technology standpoint. So I think the uptick of their use of tools is pretty significant. The last piece, I think that there's a misalignment or a lack of alignment between what patients want in terms of technology, tools and technology for engagement, and what we are positioned to deliver. So from a patient preference or a consumer preference, mobile application, research, scorecards, self-monitoring technology, as you mentioned, and really the use of social media for healthcare reasons. But when we see what healthcare organizations are delivering in terms of quote-unquote patient engagement, it's a different story. It's a very much static, non-connected solutions. This came out from HIMSS earlier this year. We're still tethered to sort of those traditional patient engagement products like the portal and the website. Uptick in social media, I think that's pretty significant, both in engaging with patients but also mining patient data. The patient concierge service just seems really sort of circa 1800s for me, that the last thing I want is to somebody to manually point me down. Just make it easier. I don't need much more than an info booth at best. But when I step back, to this slide, I still feel like, as an industry, we haven't caught up with patient desires or consumer desires yet. And then finally, the e-health and the actual engagement that we're doing from a technology perspective is still really focused in the administrative. These numbers are ridiculously hard to see, but off to the left, it basically says 20% of people who wish to securely message their providers have done so. So that's basically a 20% penetration in clinical communication. Off to the right, when we get to online bill paying and making an appointment, the percentage is 33%. So still very small percentages, but clearly weighted towards those sort of transactional tasks and not really value add in getting clinical care. Questions, comments, anything? Okay. Shifting gears, talking about healthcare analytics, and this is again from a very practical standpoint. You guys are all way smarter than I'll ever be in terms of clinical informatics and bioinformatics. What we know is that we're doing a better job than ever of capturing data. The volume is growing 40% a year. We're doing it through the EHRs and a host of other transactional systems, patient-generated data, et cetera, et cetera. But the big question is, what can we do with it? And, that's your question. And then, kind of my question is, what are we doing with it? And unfortunately, we're not doing much. If you go out to sort of the bread and butter healthcare delivery systems, this is really kind of how we're using healthcare data and informatics today. And the first four are really things we've been doing forever, right? There's no innovation there. Physician or provider comparative performance, outliers and risk and cost utilization. These are not rocket science activities, but yet these are the ones that that have mainstream adoption. It's not till we get down to the bottom, which have like the 22 and 23% usage rate with comparative effectiveness, impactability modeling, et cetera, are we really using the information and the skills that we're nurturing? So it's, I think if we were to go back and juxtapose that on the hype curve, ironically, here we are in sort of this, we've passed this peak of inflated expectations, and we're in that trough of disillusionment with quote-unquote big data, because we realize that it's hard and we're not doing a very good job of it yet. And a lot of that it has to do with the skills and the resources available to do that in your mainstream healthcare system. Even if they had all of you, I'm not sure they'd know in many cases what to do with you. I think that's changing. I think it's changing in some of the more innovative and larger healthcare systems, but it's definitely a trickle-down process. And what I see as probably the biggest challenge around data and analytics for the sort of traditional healthcare system is data governance. Really understanding and structuring that data architecture and aligning it across systems, both technically and politically. Working with a big academic in the Bay Area right now, that's going to be probably their biggest challenge, is that enterprise governance around systems and data as they move to exploit what they have for clinical research purposes. And then the skill set thing, about 2 years ago, I did a sort of a roundtable with a bunch of CIOs from healthcare systems, and they were Adventist and Spectrum, and I think it wasn't Northwestern, but another one in Chicago, Advocate. There were about 6 or 7 CIOs, and they all said their biggest concern was to find the people that had both the technical and the analytic and the clinical skills for their organizations for the next 2 to 3 years. So I love this definition. But I did, and I'll tell you, not everybody loves this definition. And Bill and Steve, I'll welcome your perspectives. It came from a VP at Explorus, a person, data scientist is a person who uses data and information to ask the question you should have asked, not the one you did. And I think there's a lot of truth to that, right? It's helping us sort of evolve our thinking. You know, because if it were left up to me, I'd just hand out clipboards all the time. Just kidding. But so it becomes sort of a mindset that you guys are always thinking about, well, what? Well, what does that mean? What does that really mean? In my role, and because I focus so much on healthcare IT strategy, I'm always thinking about what's next. I haven't really thought much about EHRs for 10 years because I'm always thinking about what's next. And I think from a data scientist standpoint, you know, what's the question behind the question? However, not everybody loves this definition. I have a physician colleague who had sort of a visceral reaction to it. It was interesting. He said he felt like it was an offensive definition to the physician, right? Because it would offend their clinical expertise. Don't tell me what question I should be asking. And I think that may be more his own sort of personal position than maybe not representative of the whole physician community. But I also took it as a note of caution to how clinical informaticists, how we approach sort of that melding of disciplines. And again, back to that same question, you know, now that we've got the data, what can we do with it? What should we be doing with it? You know, I'm sort of the what can we do with it, which was that slide of archaic reporting. You know, what can we do with it is, you know, your responsibility as informaticists. Finally, health information exchange, the ugly stepchild of healthcare IT. And it's fascinating. Have you guys ever tried to explain to somebody out of healthcare or healthcare IT why 2 EHRs don't talk to one another? I said it's like we all are using different dollars, and every dollar has a different basis. And people get it. They're like, so my dollar's worth 98 cents, and yours is worth $1.04, and they're all in, you know, different currencies. But so there's health information exchange, the verb, which is the actual transaction, and there's health information, the organization. And today, or this was earlier this year, based on a sort of a standard definition, there's about 106 operational health information exchanges in the United States. Again, the frenzy of HIEs popping up everywhere based on high-tech funding, it's dissipating. I would anticipate that within 5 years, half of these HIEs will be gone. And I'll get to this in a minute, there's all sorts of technical and political challenges with these. And I think the capabilities of healthcare inherent systems to start exchanging better will mitigate the needs for these organizations to basically be hub and spokes. So, Bill, I'll come back in 5 years and we'll revisit this slide. The challenge with HIEs in terms of the verb is today we're basically exchanging PDFs, static documents. So we've got organizations that are struggling and the information that they're exchanging is marginally of value in many cases. So, sort of stepping back, what are the challenges health information exchange experiences from both a noun and a verb standpoint? Has anybody worked in or for a health information exchange? So I'd love your perspective on this. The ones I work with, they spend a lot of time sort of either navel-gazing or fighting about semantics in many cases. So what's our governance model? Who's going to pay for what? Who's in the pecking order? But then we get to things, very legitimate things like privacy and confidentiality concerns. What I see from the noun, from the health information exchange perspective, there's really not a lot of technical issues in their challenges or many times in their demise. Probably the last two, the patient matching and the consent model, can be the most complex from a process or a procedure standpoint as well as a technical standpoint. Conversely, on the verb side, the actual exchange of the information, that's where the plumbing gets complicated. Patient matching and consent model complexity are very, very complicated. About a year and a half ago, I did some work here in the Pacific Northwest between Kaiser and Providence and Intel. Intel had some on-site clinics using one EHR and was doing and is doing kind of a risk-based insurance care delivery model where Intel employees will get their care at the clinics on the Intel campus, and then will get their secondary, tertiary care at either Kaiser or Providence. As we worked through the mechanics of that, the consent model complexity was probably the most challenging attribute of the whole program. And what data, even down to the data element, under what circumstances gets released for what patient type, et cetera, et cetera. So until we can sort some of that out, that makes the data exchange and the value of the data exchange rather marginalized. And the rest of these you're familiar with, the data integrity, quality, and I think the lack of integration in actual clinical workflow. With the exception of things like Epics, My Care Everywhere, so many of the times you have to go outside your clinical workflow to get to any exchange information or click down into a PDF buried, 43 clicks down. I think that is troublesome for HIE as we've traditionally known it. Thoughts, comments?
I don't see standards coming from the federal government anywhere in the HIE challenges or slides. Do you think they are a big obstacle in achieving HIE?
The lack of standards?
Mm-hmm.
I do. I think there's increased standardization. A lot of that's been driven by MU and common data sets, and things like SNOMED and LOINC. So we're moving sort of gradually as an industry towards that, very gradually, like, frozen molasses. I also think we're starting to see a coalescence of thinking around standards.
Well, I was going to say, it's interesting that the fact that we have to have HIE, the noun, that we have to have these organizations. Even though we do, because otherwise it wouldn't happen, but theoretically, if data were liquid, as some people have called for it to be, it should just flow automatically. If you're a healthcare provider, or a patient who wants your data sent from point A to point B, it should just happen, rather than have to go between some kind of HIE organization or entity.
Yeah.
you think there are cases where PDFs are used to protect market share for vendors? Because if you can't actually have data flow from one system to another, then it's easier to keep a hospital connected to them.
If I have all of my healthcare data, I can go anywhere with it and get care anywhere. It's a lot, the analogy would be, your phone number portability. Once I didn't have to change phone numbers and changing carriers, I could shop around for carriers. So how much of the inertia is maybe not consciously but subconsciously due to the entities themselves not wanting patients to be able to shop around? Like once you go to that clinic, it's hard for you to leave because your information can't leave.
Yeah.
I've been at meetings at other organizations, not at OCU, where administrators specifically said it's better for us not to share patient data outside of the system because it keeps referrals internal.
Yeah, I mean, truly, right? I did some. Takes a village.
Hey, we're a technology shop.
That's right. Yeah, it's not going to help in there. All right. So I've done a lot of work at Sutter Health, and one of their main drivers for an enterprise HIE, which was referrals, particularly in lab test leakage. That was costing them, tens of $millions a year. So they went out and they invested in a HIE product to connect. They already have Epic in their hospitals and their clinics, but to connect sort of that secondary level of physicians who did a lot of referrals to the Sutter systems. So it is all about retention and referrals. Any other questions or comments on this? I know we've got just a couple more minutes, and I'll leave it open for bantering.
So I've had this running question in my head as you've been talking, and that is when we have these periods of accelerated progress and growth, there's always something that we're missing or losing behind that we just feel heavy, but we don't realize that it's people are fighting that back. So you've obviously been doing this and thinking about this for a really long time. So what is it that you think you might be losing in this process that we need to try to implement?
Clipboards. Just kidding. There was 4, 5, 6, 7 years ago this huge backlash about, my doctor is going to just think about me as a number. They're going to stare at the computer screen. This was this whole sort of mechanization of the care process. I think we're working through that because as individuals, as a society, and as a healthcare system, we're learning to work with the technology differently. So it's integrating it into the care system and the care interaction. How many have gone to Zoom Plus or Zoom Care? Right? Yes, favorite healthcare. They just flip the chart and they're like, okay, this is all your information. Here's what I'm typing in. Is it, So it's a very transparent process, and you're still interacting face-to-face with your provider. So I think 5, 6 years ago, the concern was we're going to lose the care in medicine. I think we're maturing our thought around that to think we're going to make the care even better in medicine because of technology. So that's amazing. I think that's it. Oh, I really liked this slide. First, the message it was around, and the y-axis is incentive to share data outside the healthcare system, and the x-axis is sort of the level of integration across within the healthcare organization. I really liked this slide, and then I went back and I read what the author wrote about it, and I'll pop it up on the screen in a second. But it essentially says, lower left-hand corner, it's sort of the fee-for-service model. Lack of integration, low incentive to share data. It's just a volume-based, transactional healthcare delivery system. That's kind of what we've lived in. And then we move sort of towards this mid-ground, which is the total cost of care, where a single healthcare organization assumes responsibility for caring for an event. And then sort of that nirvana in the middle is this bundled episode of care where you're working across a number of healthcare entities or providers, kind of in the ACO model, where you have both clinical integration and a need and an incentive to share information to keep unnecessary costs down. I thought, that's a really nice graph, the way it's described, and it represents a lot of sort of complex concepts. And then I went back and I read this author who was had a little bit more of an acerbic approach or tone to his writing. And so he writes, or she writes, riskless fee-for-service preserves the medical archipelago, and full-risk ACO arrangements turn the archipelago into quasi-monopolistic super islands using landlocked patients to achieve institutional rents. And I thought, man, bam, don't mess around. But truly, that's what has happened, right? So, we get these sort of ACO monopolistic super islands. I believe we will evolve past that, sort of with the data liquidity concept, but we're certainly in that transitional era. And I wish I could write like that. So that's it. That's all I had to really, from a slide perspective, but I'd love to talk more, answer more questions, or